The Norwegian Method.
I'm Olav Alexander Bu, peak human performance developer, coach to Christian Blumenfeld and Gustav Iden.
I'm Dr. David Lipman, a health and human performance specialist, and welcome to the Norwegian Method podcast.
The Norwegian Method.
Welcome back to the Norwegian Method podcast. Joining me as always, well, not always, but many times, half the time, is Olav. Thanks for joining me, Olav.
Thank you, David.
And as I've been doing recently, or in the last couple of episodes, been throwing back to a few episodes that may help us understand the topic better. I mean, this topic, balancing VO2Max and efficiency, this is kind of built on most of this season, if I'm honest. There's certainly some stuff in season 1 that's helpful, but specifically episodes that I think would be helpful from season 3 are balancing metabolics, aerodynamics, and thermodynamics from the 12th of June, our power profile case study, from the 17th, and then the flat power profile that was 17th of March, and then the flat power profile from March 13th. So those will give us some insight there into what we were talking about, which was steeper and flatter profiles, which is part of what we're talking about today, or it affects it, and then balancing aspects of things like aerodynamics and thermodynamics and these trade-offs that we make. And it's a similar thread we're going to pull on today, which is really around, I guess, trading off VO2Max and efficiency, because there is a trade-off there. So let's start there. Why is there a trade-off?
So the reason why there is a trade-off between, for example, VO2Max and efficiency is that we have a limited time we can spend on training, or even less if we are anchoring it back to the episode where we talked about the maximum sustainable energy expenditure. You have a certain amount of energy that you actually can expend on training, because you also need to, for resting, you need for recovery, you need the other things you do as well. So there's a limited amount you can really put into training. You can, of course, try to put in more into training, but very often with adverse effects, such as, for example, that you start limiting or basically limiting the further development, because you maybe train a little bit more than, for example, than what you're capable of recovering or absorbing and adapting to. But the reason why we have to do trade-offs there, efficiency, we really don't want to do trade-offs on, but on the VO2Max is where we end up having to make trade-offs on, basically. And to give an example, the thing is that it is easy to think that these two metrics are separate. And here's also where I want to also make people or remind people about that there is a difference between utilization and efficiency. And very often people confuse economy, for example, or basically fuel economy or carbohydrate economy, the utilization of fat, for efficiency. But it's a separate thing. It is more efficient to use carbs than it is to use fats. But it's more something we link to utilization and how we tune utilization based on what kind of race you're going to do. If it's highly stochastic, if it's a short event, if it's a long event, and so on. Efficiency comes more down to the simple fact of being able to use oxygen, for example, or actually calorimetry as efficiently as possible, or convert energy as efficiently as possible into forward propulsion with the least possible energy. That is efficiency, and it would be the same whether you went to a race car and you just started to discuss, for example, efficiency there. For example, in Formula One today, you have the battery, which you can almost consider a little bit like the anaerobic system, and then you have the fuel tank, which is the aerobic system. And the thing is that independently of whether you use the battery or whether you use use fuel to propel your car forward, you are still always looking about efficiency as, for example, how efficiently are you able to convert that energy into forward propulsion? And it has to do with how you are converting it in between there, how your engine is designed, and so on. But then you have the utilization, which comes more, how do you rely on the different systems for propulsion? And in this episode, when we talk about VO2Max and we talk about efficiency, I think it also makes sense to talk about utilization as well, because it is linked. It is linked to that. That's why we need to make the biggest. We have to make the compromise mostly due to utilization and the glycolytic capacity that we have in our body available, or glycogen capacity we have in our body. So what happens when you start to move more to, let's say, shorter events, and you want to build a higher VO2 max, so you are building a body that can deliver more energy per time, typically for short times. Muscles, typically, maybe you increase the force and ability to produce torque or force with the different muscles you have. We one of the things that we observe is that those muscles that are more responsible for maybe, and of course still talking about the triathlon the last 2 hours is not really where the shifts are happening, but let's say for sports that last for example only a couple of minutes down to sub-minute, for example, then obviously we are starting to prioritize also development of muscle fibers that are can do more or can produce more force, but they also are far less efficient, and they also rely obviously much more on glycogen than or glycolytic energy than than on aerobic energy, to put it that way. But one thing that also what people don't think about is that a big engine is very often, or let's say a larger heart. So let's say that if you wanted to go for an Ironman and you wanted to keep a very high VO2 max, the consequence of that, for example, is theoretically speaking, that you would need a larger heart as well. And one of the things that we have seen, is that when you prioritize more VO2 max training, we also see that efficiency goes down. Not only utilization goes down, but that's more a consequence of something you want to have, but you see also efficiency comes down. And some of those things can be linked to that. You obviously need a larger heart. And if you have a larger heart, that will cost more energy to produce energy with, compared to if you have a smaller heart. So one of the things we can then theorize is that when you go more for Ironman and you prioritize, let's say, less of the high intensity training, that also potentially it actually what's happening is that your heart actually goes down in size. This has been not in exactly this kind of context, but obviously one thing we do know is that if you prioritize more VO2 max training or things, we see that obviously the heart increases in size over time. That's one of the things that are with athletes, elite athletes. They have a larger stroke volume than, for example, the normal population. One way you can look at this indirectly, for example, and not only, but it's an indirect, let's say, indicator of this, is that you can look at what we call O2 pulse. So, for example, it means simply taking the raw oxygen uptake you have. So, for example, if it's 4 liters and you then divide, or the 4,000 milliliters, and you divide it at the heart rate you have, for example. And one of the things you actually see when you go more for Ironman is that you actually see that if you, obviously not at maximal, but at sub-maximal efforts, is that actually what is happening is that the O2 pulse goes down, which is an indicator of that cardiac output, probably most likely linked to a smaller heart, or let's say that the heart basically start to doesn't get the same stimulus in the same way more, or at least not a high peak stimulus anymore, maybe then contracts or gets smaller in size. We are getting very, very, how to say, speculative here when we are speaking, but there are also other functions in the body. But the heart is very easy to use as an example, or to exemplify that. In the same way, also, if you're out and you're driving a car on the road and you put in, as you said, oh, I want to have a super big engine in my car. So you install an engine. So let's say you're going to drive, you're going to follow the traffic rules, and you're going to follow the speed limits down the road, but you put in a 500 kilowatt or 1000 kilowatt engine into your car, like a Bugatti Veyron engine or Koenigsegg engine or something like this. The problem with that is that you have now such a large engine in there that if you're always running it at 100 kilometers per hour on the road, or maybe even 50 kilometers on the road, or even slower, the problem with that engine is that it will still use much more fuel than a small, very efficient engine that is made, let's say, for the range that you actually need to have in a car. Not only because it is much bigger, but it's basically heavier, and there are other things with it as well. So scaling down the engine for the need is always more efficient for what you're going to do. And in Ironman and other kinds of racing, we have two limiters, especially in these endurance events. One is the substrate availability, and the second thing is actually critical core temperature as well. Because if you have a larger engine, you're also going to produce more heat in general because you have lower efficiency. That's going to increase the core temperature faster than if you had a small engine, even at sub-maximal efforts. So these are the things that are linked there. And that means that if you really want to be the best, like you're fighting for the world champs, you can't just say that I want to have a high this or high that. You actually have to tune your engine and your body for peak performance in the race that you want to do. That means that VO2max, lowering your VO2max is purely a consequence of that you don't have available time to really build it as big as you would like to have. You could say that theoretically speaking, no, I want to have the same VO2max for an Ironman as I do have for short distance triathlons or cyclocross or whatever you like, more shorter races where you need a very high VO2max. But the consequence of that, if you went to an Ironman, is that you would need to not only, then you would obviously have a higher curve or a larger capacity in the short domain, but you would then need to build equally much capacity all the way out to 8 hours, to put it that way. And that would require such a large training volume that we are already at the limit when it comes to maximum sustainable energy expenditure. And to be able to build such a capacity that where you basically end up with the same efficiency, same utilization, but with such a high VO2max would probably require, I don't know, 200-300% more training volume than what we currently have, maybe even more. I don't know. I have no clue. But it's where basically your day would be basically only be eating. That's what it. There isn't time for training anymore. To just try to illustrate how extreme that would be.
I mean, and from an energy expenditure standpoint, you probably don't even eat. You probably just give liquid nutrition IV because it's so inefficient. But I wanted to bring up a point that I think people misunderstand or overlook often is there is an energy and an oxygen cost to heart and lungs. And I think people misunderstand that. It's kind of the engine analogy you've been given is like it does cost energy. It's a net gain, obviously, but it does cost energy to use your lungs and your heart. So it's worthwhile considering the size of the musculature in the heart is what you're talking about as well, and the myocardium. But I just wanted to double click here. I think let's just take 1 minute and really be clear on what is efficiency, what is economy, and what's fractional utilization, just so that people have really got that clear in case they're still getting muddled in their mind. So as you said, efficiency is basically the conversion of, let's call it raw power to speed, right? How well do we convert that?
Yeah, and then maybe to avoid any confusion there, that when we say raw power, we can even say that because there are many different power along the road.
Yep.
There. We have net mechanical, we have gross mechanical, then you have net metabolic, and you have gross metabolic. But the point is that what we really are looking for here is because we need oxygen and we need substrates to be able to go the fastest. So when we talk raw power in this sense, we actually talk about gross metabolic. That's how we quantify it. But it's basically is the ability to take raw oxygen and the substrates you have available and turn that as efficiently as possible into, how does it say, directional speed or velocity.
The Norwegian method.
The reason why you want to have a VO2 master, because when athletes or customers comes there and they are doing the training, they're putting in money and hours into improving the fitness, you want to have a device that basically allows you to track their progress, but also measuring the metabolic power as well. And then on top of that, the only way to truly be able to do individualization is also to measure the utilization of the athletes. And there is probably no better device on the market to do that with than, for example, the VO2 master.
If you've been thinking about adding VO2 testing to your training facility, you know our viewers get an exclusive one-on-one consultation with their product experts on how to make VO2 Master work for you. Head to vo2master.com/Norwegian-method to book yours today, or follow the link in our show notes.
The Norwegian method.
Yep. Okay. And so then economy, how would we define economy in that context?
Problem here is that economy is a little bit of a vague concept, because we can talk about substrate economy. So basically, just how do you balance this, and that's what we normally talk about when we talk about utilization, or to use the word that you introduced, and that is fractional utilization. We talk fractional utilization of VO2Max, for example, at the intensity you're staying, as a gauge of or a way of quantifying it more accurately, and then looking obviously at what is a CO2 at that intensity as well. But we can also talk about work economy as well, and then you also introduce a whole lot of other things as well, like for example what kind of clothing you're using, aerodynamics, a lot of other things that also makes a difference on your, let's say, your efficiency, how fast you're able to race. But in this context, when we talk about economy here, it's a little bit of a, we don't talk about economy as an interchangeable term with efficiency. It is something that more is call it a big bucket with a lot of things that goes in there. The three terms we will be talking about is, on the one side, is VO2Max, because it is such a easy metric to quantify and reproduce and use as a gauge for what's happening, and it gives also a little bit of potential. And then the second part is the efficiency, basically how effectively are you able to convert that oxygen into forward propulsion, or let's say velocity, and here also differentiating between speed and velocity, because if you look at the treadmill really measures velocity. It's basically, it only measures raw directional speed, so velocity. But when you run on a treadmill, you will actually see that the person that is there, he's maybe going a little bit like this. So that means already there is a velocity, as I call it, another velocity that is higher. There's also kind of a lateral velocity as well. So you could also substitute that for, call it, gross velocity and net velocity as well. But to avoid to complicate it too much, you have the net velocity, or let's say simply the time it takes you from start to finish over the given distance that is there. And then you have in between there, which most people are used to use, and that's power. And that is actually what we quantify as the net mechanical power, not the gross mechanical power. The gross mechanical power is that when you do work on a bike, or you run, or you swim, there is a drag component. For example, let's say not drag component. That's not. Put it in cycling. There is. You have the net mechanical power, which is basically just a measure of the resultant power that you are put into the pedals, that actually acts perpendicular to the crank arm. And this changes all the way throughout a pedaling revolution, from being, let's say, partially positive to almost ideal positive, to less ideal when you come towards the bottom, until it basically ends up being actually negative work or negative power or force or torque in one portion of your pedaling stroke. But that's still work. It is still work that is happening there, but it doesn't contribute to make you pedal faster. And then this is not as easy as just saying that let's optimize it for 100%, because the body also works in a cyclic action. We know that the body and legs and other things are actually contributing to helping pumping blood around in the body. And then because of that, it relies on a cyclic action where there's a rest and work and rest and work and so on. But there's a limit to how much you really want to do or allow for negative work, because it basically then will start to become inefficient. And then you can take the step all the way. What we can't measure very effectively today, we don't really have good methods for that today, is to measure the net metabolic power. Net metabolic power is really where you take away the basal metabolic, and you only look at the, let's say, the metabolics that is used for propulsion. A protocol, and some things that people have done a little bit, is that they measure the resting metabolic rate, and then they subtract that from the gross metabolic. But the problem is that it doesn't work. And the reason for that is that the resting metabolic, or the basal metabolic rate, is hugely influenced by other factors as well, like even when you're training and how the body is regulating energy. So I would say that trying to subtract it away from there doesn't really work very well. And then it comes down to also what you say, and that is that it's very easy to say that, okay, you have two kinds of work, and one part of the work is what is for basically the mechanical work that moves you forward, and then the other bucket is the thermal work, and that's a two course definition. We've said we say it sometimes just to simplify things, but in reality, there is external mechanical work, and then there's internal mechanical work, which is exactly like you say. It's the lungs, it's the heart, it's the purely the, let's say, what happens with the whole cardiovascular system, even the brain for cognitive processes and so on. So there is a lot of things also in the body that do require also energy to function, and then you're left with a part that is what we could almost say that, because we also need to keep a certain body temperature as well. That's important. So we can't say that we want to remove all thermal work and only use it for propulsion, because that wouldn't work either. There's an ideal temperature range we want to be in, because it makes our body actually even more efficient. So actually 37 degrees Celsius is not the most efficient state to be in when you're exercising. You want it to be a little bit higher, because it actually helps by, for example, offloading oxygen from the hemoglobin to the muscles. But again, it's a limit to it. So the heat part of it, we can say that we don't want excess heat. That's the inefficiency part of the equation. And then when we say also that the heart do work, that means also when the heart do mechanical work that requires energy, there is also a heat component to that as well. So that is a part of all the things that also produces heat and contributes to the rise in core temperature as well. So it's a complex, really complex structure. But then to bring it back down again to where we started and where we're going to continue, VO2Max is all, or I would imagine at least most of our listeners, they know what VO2Max is. Efficiency, yes, most people have a feeling for efficiency, but we use the term efficiency as purely the ability to turn energy, so basically oxygen and substrates, into net velocity, or the time over the distance, and then everything in between there that doesn't link or contribute to that is basically where there are some losses along the road there, and you want to optimize those. And then you have utilization, or fractional utilization of VO2Max, as you said, but utilization, and that is simply where do you tune in. What's the ratio between the way we look at that more specifically is actually looking at the ratio between CO2 production and oxygen consumption at the race pace you're doing compared to what your VO2Max is. And then the fractional utilization is purely actually where you just take the percentage of oxygen at that intensity versus VO2Max. Or more used in literature is very often where they link that fractional utilization purely to your threshold, your second threshold, or LT2. So they look at MLSS or LT2. You look at purely what is the oxygen consumption at LT2 versus oxygen consumption at max, and then you look at the percentage there. And what will happen is that the closer you bring this up towards your VO2Max, the higher the utilization, the better the utilization of fat is up to a higher intensity, but with the consequence of that you very often also you also train down or reduce your glycolytic power or anaerobic power as a consequence of that at the same time, and vice versa. If you want to go for shorter events, track cycling and other things, then you actually need to bring it down. So you actually need to rather improve your glycolytic system, but it comes with the consequence of the utilization comes down, at least when we look at, let's say, a single cohort of people.
And so when we think about efficiency for an Ironman athlete, we are effectively maximizing fractional utilization at the cost of VO2Max, because that will make us more efficient for 8 to 20 hours or 8 to 17 hours or whatever the sort of maximal cutoffs are. So just to try and really repeatedly touch on things so people really get it. So hoping that's all clear for everybody. And thank you. That's actually cleared some stuff up for me as well. So very helpful to get some, sometimes we have these ideas of what a word means, but having a clear definition is very helpful. So I guess we've talked a lot about power profiling, right? Yep. And is it is this something, these sort of metrics, something we would use in addition to power profiling, or can we just lump them together and black box them with power profiling of sorts? Can we just say, listen, we've changed the curve like this, and therefore we've done X via our metabolics, roughly?
So that's where, of course, you can use it as a surrogate for it. But I would say that it comes with some caveats. So you would normally say that if you get a more of a horizontal profile, flatter profile, poor profile as a consequence of your training, not artificially, but actually as a natural distribution or redistribution of your training volume towards an Ironman, then you would normally also see that if you went to a laboratory to check, for example, your VO2 max and your utilization or fractional utilization of VO2 max, you would see that in almost all cases also then would be reflected there as well. However, there is still quite a bit of range there. So some athletes, where let's say that you made let's say you had two twins and you made they say, well, maybe not identical twins, but let's say that you took two different persons that with the same profile, and you made that kind of tuning, you would still see that maybe one have, let's say let's say that you took your 60-minute power. So let's say you had a profile that basically was consisting of all-out efforts.
Yep.
If you don't have all-out efforts, let's say that you used 5-minute power and 20-minute power, and you looked at 5-minute power and 20-minute power, not as a function of purely your intervals and other things here. Maybe it's easier to talk about actually all-out effort just for the sake of
keeping it clean. Yeah.
If we say 5-minute and 60-minute all-out efforts, if we took both of these athletes and we brought 5-minute came down as a natural consequence because you started to prioritize more the longer training. So 60-minute were coming up, and you went from, let's say that you changed this by 10%. Then you would say that, okay, we would then assume that will be the same that also happen more or less, given that we use 5-minute and 60-minute, that would be almost the same that you would see in the laboratory, that VO2 max came down equally many percent and your LT2 came up equally many percent. However, that is not always the case. You will see that it trends in that direction, but how much can be quite different from athlete to athlete depending on how they respond. And that's why I never personally, when you work with the best in the world, or you want to try to understand things better and understand how one athlete responds to something compared to another athlete, the benefit of using, for example, the device like a VO2 master and to quantify this is that it allows me to see that, okay, for this athlete, even though the curve have changed this much now, I actually have more room to do things here without compromising other things. While for another athlete, I might say, okay, now we've gotten a profile here which looks good for an Ironman, but you start to see there are some limiters that are showing up. Because you can also say that, yes, we want to increase the utilization as much as possible for an Ironman, but we have to remember that Ironman also do have surges as well. Because if you are on the tail and you need to overtake, that's going to cost you energy going in the front there. And that means that ideally you want to leave a little bit of room to play with there. And that's the thing that you don't get from purely looking at a power profile. That's where, because when you then look at, okay, what does this cost in terms of glycogen and other things, you might see that becomes more less ideal for one person, more ideal for another person when you do it. But like you say, yes, linking it to black boxing it, I would say that if I had to black box, I would rather black box what sits in the middle and not the ends of it. So the way you propose, there you decide to black box truly the input side of the equation here, and you leave a little bit more for guesswork by rather saying that you use now power versus, for example, or just power to try to build a picture of this, but far better than nothing.
Yeah, I think we talked about this quite a bit in the first season. It's all about resources from a coaching standpoint, right? Or an athlete standpoint, if they're self-coached, is like, what do you have access to? At the end of the day, you could probably get by with just a stopwatch, right? And some distance markers. But ideally, the more tech you have, the easier your life becomes, the more texture we get and the more insight we get. And we start to understand why we're seeing the changes, not what the changes are, but why we see them, which can be helpful to then understand how to do it better or something like that. But
Yeah.
you make a really good point that I wanted to underscore, particularly if there's students and maybe young professionals, young coaches listening. Is I certainly was taught it, in universities and things like this, that once we go beyond a certain duration, that the metabolism looks like this, right? It's ultra endurance is very fat dominant and all these things. I think that's true if we were to only do a very consistent time trial at that distance. As soon as we are racing or there's a hiccup, right, hills or whatever, all of a sudden it becomes a lot more stochastic, as you say. And all of a sudden you start to see, oh, wait, these guys are actually going, or girls are going towards VO2 max repeatedly and then coming back and recovering. And the physiology of that or the training for that looks very different. So optimizing for a time trial, so let's call it when Christian was going for sub 7, like optimizing for that looks very different to optimizing winning Nice, because Nice is a lot different from a like stochastic nature in terms of both bike dynamics, the course, all that stuff. So I think it's worthwhile probably not worrying about that if you're still time trialing, but as you get towards more peak performance, you start having to think about race dynamics a lot more.
Yeah. And I think also in this case is that, let's say that you were from an engineering approach, if you were working for let's say a Formula One team,
Yep.
There are a couple of key things that you can say that, okay, if you only were to look at three things there, it would actually be the exact same thing there. Fuel is key on the track because it basically dictates your strategy.
Yep.
How many pit stops are you going to have? And of course, there are rule changes there since the old days. But basically, how much fuel is your car going to use when you're out? That is super important, because you can make a car go faster. But the problem is that you then end up with a very poor strategy in the end, because you have to go in, refuel, and all these kind of things. That's going to lose you critical time. That is there. So obviously on the one side, you need to measure, or you need to know what is the fuel consumption of your car. Then you have the part that sits in the middle. And it's very easy to think that very often the engine is input to the system, but it's not. That's just a converter. The engine is purely the converter of the energy into propulsion. And that's why you want to keep track. Obviously, the engine is super important to keep track of, because you want to know how you're tuning this engine to basically optimize between fastest possible lap times, or let's say race time in the end, because that's what matters in the end. It's not one lap, but it's the consistency over the whole race, compared to the fuel that goes into that engine there. So with that, we have the GPS, which obviously does a beautiful work for us. It's not 100% reliable, but it's a really good system that have made the world much simpler when it comes to keeping track of segments and times and these kind of things. And if you have a stopwatch, that's even more brilliant when it really is about figuring out some of these small details. But that's more, I would say, not very critical anymore. It's the GPS or the GNSS that is really the key to it. Then you have the power meters that we have today, and most power meters now, like Body Rocket, it's a new system they're working on now. You can actually see the differentiation between net mechanical power and gross mechanical power. So you can actually see in which direction is the force or torques going in, and then you can say, okay, if you change the crank arm length or something like this compared to your body size, because most people also think that the crank is the only lever you have on your bike. You don't. It's the foot plate from basically where the cleat is to your ankle joints, from your ankle joint up to your knee joint, from your knee joint basically to your hip joint, and then basically how all this is interacting between the left and right, upper body and so on. And when you change crank arm, one thing that you will very quickly see there is that you, without doing any training at all, this can actually lead to optimization, pure, like immediate optimization of your pedaling by having the right crank arm length. And that is really beautiful with the power meters like Body Rocket system, is that you can see this in real time, what's happening. Okay, let's change the crank. Change it, you're sitting on a turbo, and you suddenly see, okay, efficiency, mechanical efficiency improved by 5%. And then we're talking pure, not utilization, we're talking about pure mechanical efficiency that have improved as a function of picking the right crank arm for you. Then this is also not static. This can change with training, it change with position and this kind of thing. But the point is, it's a fantastic tool to track that. So power meter, you have the GNSS or GPS system. You have for example, the Body Rocket system that now allows you to track in real time where the forces go when you're pedaling, and you can see the net mechanical power and the gross mechanical power. And then you have the gross input into the system, or the true input to the system, and that is oxygen, and obviously it's the substrates in the body. These three tools, then you are it's basically is Formula One in physiology training. Yeah.
The Norwegian method.
The reason why I use Maurten with the boys is because it reduces the GI stress. And the reason why it reduces the GI stress is basically because carbohydrates are packed in a hydrogel. And why that is important again is because if you can then take more carbohydrates per time, it means basically also you can train faster or race faster, which ultimately is the goal in our sport.
To benefit from the one-time code and get 20% off your next purchase on Maurten.com, simply enter the code TNMS1 at checkout. The code is applicable once per customer on all products except the Maurten bicarb system, valid until the 31st of December 2025.
The Norwegian method.
In
On a
physiology.
bike.
Yeah.
Okay. So we sort of touched on this a little bit before, but we talked about the balance, or we talked about the difference between athletes and a power duration curve, and the physiology that supports that power duration curve is perhaps different between athletes. So in that, is the ideal balance of VO2Max and things like fractional utilization and the resultant efficiency, is that specific to the athlete, or is that more specific to the event, so to speak? I mean, is there differences between athletes that you would use for the same goal outcome, I guess? So Christian and Gustav being prime examples because they physically look different, their physiology is quite different, and people understand that inherently looking at them.
Yeah. Christian and Gustav as an example, and also Kasper, but Christian and Gustav in particular are have different physiology. Like you can just look at their body type and you see that it's different. But then you can say that maybe they are more similar if you go, let's say, underneath the skin of them.
Yeah.
And the answer to that is yes and no. They're obviously, yes, they're both training for endurance athletes, for endurance events. And it's the same event as well. And they even are competing against each other to win. But the main difference there is that just take off season for the two guys. Christian, when he has off season, he loses almost nothing at LT1, LT2, or let's say he loses almost nothing at LT2. But VO2Max is a place where he suffers off season when he comes back. Gustav is the opposite. Gustav basically loses very little on VO2Max, but he loses very, very quickly his LT2. So LT2 goes down, and that means that obviously already there you understand that then you need to prioritize a little bit differently. Christian needs a little bit more high intensity training to basically get out his potential, even for an Ironman. Gustav, he needs a little bit more on the, let's say, LT1 and LT2 training for him to get the best out of him, or to basically be equal.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think I'm hoping that we gain some insight into some of the things that drive this. I know there's lots of work being done in, muscle fiber typing, because that's the thing that everyone points at and goes, that must be the difference, right? More slow twitch versus faster twitch. I'm not convinced it's that simple.
I would actually even say that I wouldn't even spend time on it. And the reason for that is because that's probably one of the things I would just black box. And the reason why I would black box exactly, I think, is that because when you are looking at it, if you start to go too much into physiology, into the nitty-gritty details and trying to understand it here, the problem is that you don't have a good tool to really quantify and look at the changes that are happening there. So there's very little learnings to take away from this, except from basically trying to make some assumptions around things, which is not a very strong position to come from. So rather what you want to say is that you need to keep track, obviously, of how fast your athlete is going. Is the aerodynamics too poor? Is that good? Is basically athlete producing a lot of heat for a certain velocity or not, for example? How well is the cooling, for example? How are they pedaling, for example? Is the pedaling efficient or is it not? But one of the problems sometimes with this is that we know that this is not a statical picture. It's not like you can have a 5 minute or 3 minute picture of somebody and then you say that it looks good. That's a little bit the weakness sometimes when you are in the laboratory and you just do a standard step profile, because you're looking at 6 minutes or 5 minutes or 3 minutes or 8 minutes or 10 minutes, whatever, how long your steps are there. You're looking at basically something that has a very short duration and is very artificial compared to what you do out when you're racing. And you're using this as a picture, but taking this as a fact, saying that, okay, now your body is like this, that's a little bit dangerous. And that's where tools like lactate can be very useful when you actually start applying it in the field instead, because you can look at it, or for example, in a long training session, what is happening with the lactate as a function of a long training session, and that can inform you. But even better, starting to look at, for example, oxygen uptake as a function of duration. So not only because we are very often used to think of VO2Max as something you just do, like you do all like a graded exercise and then you capture a number. That number has actually, again, for using the same word, fractional value to the whole concept there. What really is valuable here is that you actually start building a VO2 curve in the same way that you build a power curve. And of course, then you say, okay, but to build a VO2 curve that is where you put 5 hours on the x-axis, and then you put VO2 on the y-axis, and then you get okay, how much VO2 are you consuming over 5 hours? That would of course be the ideal thing, but we don't have to do that, because we can still get a fairly good picture of it as long as we do 5 minutes, for example, 5-10 minutes the first hour when they are warmed up properly and starting to settle in. You can even do the warm-up to learn about that. But let's say you take 5 minutes first hour, 5 minutes, 5-10 minutes the third hour, and then take 5 minutes the last hour, and you're already getting some quite valuable data points there about how this is changing with changing core temperature, with changing fatigue, and how is actually the substrate utilization changing as well. Because that's the thing, when you go to a laboratory and somebody's going to give you a substrate profile, they just make the assumption that your substrate profile is static. It doesn't change. Like if you go this power output, then it's going to be like this. If you go this power, then it's going to be like this. And that's even before you're looking into the limitation of modeling using respiratory or gas exchange as a direct measure of substrate utilization. You can easily change this. I've spoken on this on podcast before with Peter T, and I think maybe we have even talked about it. And that is that you can easily manipulate your gas exchange for a period without that it actually changes your substrate utilization or the metabolics significantly at all. And that's the thing that, of course, when you go into laboratory and you basically you're 100% reliant on a couple of things. That one, that what you do there are not some artifacts or the things that are influencing the profile there. And then, of course, you can say, well, I do this over some time. I'm able to reduce the noise and so on. Yes, that's true. But what you don't capture with it is what's happening as you get more fatigued with change in environment because of higher temperature, for example, higher core temperature, all of that, less efficient pedaling, starting to rely more maybe on to bring in the fiber types, for example, that you start to rely a little bit more on type 2 fibers, which there are more and more publication coming and showing that you don't need to do high force to involve the type 2 fibers. Type 2 fibers will get involved in your training even with low force, as long as you go closer and closer to exhaustion as well, because the body will utilize whatever is needed to be able to continue to do what your brain says that you're going to do, as long as you're capable of doing it. But that means also that your substrate utilization also will change, and that is something that you won't get from basically only using a power meter or speed profile or velocity profile. You won't get it from that. To be able to get that, that's where you actually need to have the metabolics. But the good thing with it, yes, if you can ride with it for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and you can build a good profile there in the beginning. So VO2, so instead of a power duration profile, or let's say a mechanical power duration profile, you can say you build a metabolic duration profile instead, and you actually see how this is changing. And of course, for the longer duration, that's where you need to say that, okay, you bring it on, take it off, bring it on, take it off a couple of times, just to track a little bit what the trends are as you go longer. And that's a really beautiful way to then be able to build very robust metabolic profile, understand what's happening. And then I think there are probably a lot of videos out in the past from we being up in Sierra Nevada, and we had sessions that lasted for 7.5, 8 hours long, and where we actually did this. We brought on basically VO2 Master and used lactate, for example, at regular intervals throughout those 8 hours of training. I remember one athlete that was up there. He was a middle distance runner, for 800 meter runner or something like this. And he came down to do his first session, and we had already started training and and so on. And okay, he saw Christian doing the training, and then he came down later that day in the afternoon for a second session. He's seeing Christian and me there still. It's like, what the heck? They said, like, are you also on the second session? No. We started before today, and we are now starting to get towards the end. He was so amazed by this. So at the lunch, he came over to the table and said, I also want to do this. And my suggestion to him was that don't do this if you want to excel at basically middle distance running, because that will really put such a big dent in your training that it will push down your profile. Like, okay, doing it once, who knows? But if he wanted to do that more, then it would not be good. So
maybe when he transitions to ultramarathons, he can start doing that. But just to double click on a couple of things, because listeners will be wanting some detail here. If you're doing a 5-10 minute sample across that time, I assume you're talking about probably doing that towards the hour. So let's say you do it probably fresh or just after warm up, as you said. You would probably do it, in the last 5 to 10 minutes of the hour, and the last 5 to 10 minutes of the second hour, the last 5 to 10 of the third hour. Or if you wanted to do it on the half hour, you would do something similar to that, just so you can get a profile. And I think here there's probably no rules, but you're making choices that are going to give detail, right? So it's worthwhile considering what those choices are and why you're making those choices. It's something that you and I speak about a lot offline that I really admire about you is a lot of the way you make decisions is based on what you're trying to see based on first principles. It's like, hey, we're trying to get a duration curve here, so we're going to do them there at these points, rather than, hey, some protocol says X. It's like, what are we trying to find out? What are you trying to learn? Okay. Or if, say, someone was struggling at the 6 hour mark of an Ironman, you would take a lot of sampling at that 6 hour mark, because that's where the problems are. So you're trying to understand what's changing at that time. So I wanted to double click on that for listeners, just so they made sure, or I made sure to fill in some of that detail for them.
Super important to bring the attention back to that, because in the end it's not about protocols for us, because we're not looking to produce something statistical within a limited time frame on a population basis. What we really are, this is racing, and what we really want to understand is how a car, or in this case a human, really is responding to the fine tunings we do. If it had been simple, because even what people don't consider, look, I think that, for example, now Hamilton, for example, as an example, comes from Mercedes. He goes to Ferrari. The car is different. And how a car, like, even if you see, even in Red Bull, for example, with Max, for example, as well, like the teammates he have had up through the history, they have complained that the car is built for Max. Then there are people saying, no, it's not. But Max has a very, I'll say, a kind of a driving style which they have evolved into. But he has also grown with that kind of, let's say, racing style. And that's the same thing actually also with physiology. How we race is a function of physiology, but physiology also allows us to race differently again as well. So if we make an optimization, this is an iterative loop all the time, because as we learn to know ourselves better, this also allows us to extract better what we know from our body. But as we do that, we open up new possibilities again. There are maybe not the same group we're going to stick with one. We're going to stick with another group there now suddenly that we're racing with, that have a little bit different racing dynamics. And then we learn to utilize that again, and we advance again, or we change things over time. And this is a continuous iterative process. It's easy sometimes to say that things just takes a lot of, becoming world champion just takes a lot of time to get there. It's a very passive approach to something where you then most likely will never get there. The reason for why you get there is because this is a process, it's an iterative process, and there are some people that are really good at it, and they're able to make this tuning, and tools allows us to do this systematically even faster. But it is like you say, you need to dial it down to basically the first principle, and basically say, okay, this is the thing that we want to improve now. And then the next question is, how can we quantify this reliably in a way that actually gives us a true picture, or as true picture as possible, of how things are?
Yeah, let's leave a point on it there. That's a great way to end. Thank you for your time again, Olav. We do appreciate all listeners as well, new and old. If you're not a subscriber to the podcast, please do subscribe. If you're new here, share this with somebody. And if you're not new here, share it with somebody as well. And if you haven't yet rated the podcast, we would appreciate that. So our next episode with Olav is going to be probably one of our most popular ever, I'm sure. It's on lactate. So make sure you're subscribed so you do get that episode. And I'll talk to you next time, Olav.
Thank you, David.
The Norwegian method.